On the third day in the ICU, I overheard a nurse telling another that my room had been cleared out. I thought she meant the hospital room. Maybe they were moving me. But no, she was talking about my home. My daughter had posted photos of my living room set online. The mahogany coffee table I'd refinished by hand, my mother's vintage console, even the rocking chair I nursed both my children in, all listed, all gone, and I was still lying there, tubes in my veins, wondering if I was expected to die, or if they had simply decided I didn't matter anymore. I'm Lorraine Walker, 72, and that was the moment I knew I'd been quietly erased by the very people I once gave everything to. Subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Thanks. They didn't think I'd find out. I wasn't meant to hear that conversation. But the hospital was short-staffed. The curtains were half-drawn, and I was very much awake. The oxygen cannula burned a little at the edge of my nostrils, but I kept still, numb in places I didn't even know I had. Not from the surgery I was recovering. Slowly, steadily, but from the silence that had taken root since the ambulance carried me out of my home 2 weeks earlier. My daughter, Rachel, had texted once. "Hope you're resting." No punctuation. My son Darren hadn't bothered at all. I was told he'd taken over my keys just to keep the place going, but I hadn't given him any. He must have gone through the emergency lockbox I kept behind the porch light. I didn't even get the dignity of a phone call. I lay there, watching the drip-drip of morphine and the dim haze of early October through the window. Outside, the leaves were turning. I'd always loved the musky scent of damp earth, the crackling rust of maple leaves underfoot. Every year, I made cider on the stovetop and lit candles that smelled like cinnamon and old stories. My grandson Ben used to say my house smelled like a hug. I suppose they didn't think he'd remember that, or maybe they didn't care. You raise your children to be better than you, kinder, more aware. You keep telling yourself you're doing it right, giving them freedom, teaching them patience, showing them how to fold a towel properly, or apologize when they're wrong. You believe that real love means you don't keep score. But what do you do when they do? The furniture wasn't worth much, if we're being honest. But that wasn't the point. That was my life. My memory of a Sunday morning in 1986, when I stood barefoot on the old floor varnishing that coffee table, while the kids played with Lego nearby. The china hutch I bought at a yard sale, the year we lost everything and rebuilt from scratch. The music cabinet where I kept Frank's records, even after he passed. These weren't just objects. They were chapters. I knew things had shifted over the years. After Frank died, the visits became shorter. Holidays rotated between maybe next year and we'll try to swing by. I understood. People get busy, but I never thought I'd be discarded like a piece of mail, unopened, unread, tossed in the recycling bin before anyone realized it wasn't junk. I hadn't even been discharged yet, and my name was already gone from the mailbox. What startled me wasn't their choice to sell things. It was how quietly, how efficiently, it had been done. I saw the listings later, so I asked a friend to check for me. Rachel hadn't even cropped me out of one of the photos. There I was, in the background of the mirror, hunched in my nightgown, alive, but apparently irrelevant. I didn't say anything when the doctor came in later that afternoon. I nodded, asked about potassium levels, thanked the nurse for adjusting the pillows. I kept my voice level, but inside, something slipped. Not a loud crack, no, not like in the movies. Just a slow, low shifting, like a beam settling in an old house. A quiet break. That night, I asked to be moved to a general ward. The ICU was no longer necessary, and I wanted less noise, fewer beeping monitors. I still needed a place to think, to decide what pieces of myself I still wanted to carry forward. There's a moment, I think, in every woman's life when she realizes she's been holding her breath for years, waiting, hoping, believing that love, especially maternal love, would one day come full circle, that all the nights spent rocking fevers out of tiny bodies, all the careful budgeting so they'd have new shoes for school, that all of it would be remembered. But sometimes, the only thing that comes full circle is the silence. I fell asleep that night holding a pen. No paper, just the pen. Something about having it in my hand, the weight of it, the control it offered gave me more comfort than the warm blanket the nurse brought. I was done waiting for answers. Done hoping they'd realize what they'd done. If they had already sold my home in their minds, I would do something they didn't expect. I would give away what they hadn't yet taken. not out of spite, but because I wanted to decide, finally, what stayed with me and what did not. The funny thing about sacrifice is how invisible it becomes the moment it's no longer needed. It blends into the background, like wallpaper you stopped noticing after you moved in. And yet, it was my whole life. I didn't set out to be a mother who gave up everything. It just happened, inch by inch. At first it was simple, small things, waking up early to make Rachel's lunch exactly how she liked it, with the crusts cut off and the grapes peeled, even though I never ate breakfast myself. Staying up with Darren past midnight to help him glue together a school project he forgot to mention until the night before. There was never any resentment, only love. The kind that fills every crack and never asks why. Frank worked construction. Long hours, sometimes brutal weather. When he came home, he was quiet, not unkind, just tired. I learned to hold my worries until after dinner. I became fluent in silence, in knowing when not to speak. That's a kind of love, to the kind no one teaches you to value. When Rachel was born, I stitched her name into a little quilt, pale green and soft yellow, because we didn't know if we were having a boy or girl. I remember sitting on the floor, with my sewing kit, ankles aching from pregnancy, feeling like I was making something sacred. That quilt stayed with her through college, or at least, I thought it had. I haven't seen it in years. Darren came 2 years later. Loud lungs, even louder opinions, but soft-hearted underneath. I used to hold him when he had night terrors, humming the same hymn my mother sang to me when I was small. I remember one winter when he got the flu, and I slept sitting up in a rocking chair with him on my chest for 3 straight nights, just in case he woke up and didn't want to be alone. We didn't have much back then. There were years when Christmas meant handmade gifts and canned ham. I once pawned my wedding ring to keep the gas on through January. I never told Frank. I just slipped it back on weeks later, like nothing happened. Some truths are too quiet to share, but even in the tight years, I made birthdays feel special. Homemade cakes, decorated with what we had. One year, I crushed red candies with a rolling pin to make stained glass hearts on top of Darren's cake. Rachel cried once when I couldn't find the right shade of purple icing for hers. So the next year, I started shopping in October. There were things I never bought for myself, not because I couldn't, but because I didn't see the point. My shoes had holes before I'd even noticed. My coat was mended more times than I could count, but Rachel had her violin lessons. Darren got to play Little League. That's what mattered. I paid for their braces with money I earned from cleaning houses on the side. Quiet work, hands in bleach, mind in prayer. I remember scrubbing a woman's kitchen floor while her son practiced piano upstairs, the same piece Rachel was struggling with. And I remember thinking, maybe someday she'd understand what it took for her to keep practicing. They never knew about the second job I took after Frank passed, or the time I went without my own medication so I could help Rachel cover the deductible for Ben's asthma inhaler. There were countless little decisions like that, so many. They started to feel normal, natural, like breathing. But now, lying in that hospital bed, I wondered if they remembered any of it, or if they had filed it away, as what mothers do. Expected, invisible. I thought back to the weekends I gave up so Darren could go camping with the scouts. I was the one sewing patches onto his sash while he slept. The one packing his bag with extra socks he never remembered to thank me for. I didn't mind then. I never expected a thank you. But I did expect not to be discarded. Rachel once had a miscarriage. She called me sobbing, and I drove for hours that night to be there before sunrise. I remember crawling into bed beside her, just holding her while she shook. I stayed for a week, cooked, cleaned, answered her phone for her. I even wrote a note for her boss, asking for time off. I signed it in her name, hands trembling with her pain. Darren's divorce nearly broke him. I sat with him on the back porch as he cried into his coffee, telling me things no mother ever wants to hear from her son. I didn't try to fix it. I just listened. He said he needed someone who didn't judge him, so I stayed quiet. Carried that pain like it was my own. And then, there were the years in between the birthdays I always remembered even when they forgot mine. The letters I mailed, with checks tucked inside. Just a little something I'd write in the corner. Even when I barely had enough for my electric bill. The calls I made when the world felt heavy. The voicemails I left that never got returned. None of it felt wrong. It felt like mothering. Like doing what love asked of you, even when it didn't. Say thank you. But love, I've come to understand, is not a one-way act. It's meant to be witnessed, held, returned, even if only in small ways. And somewhere along the way, mine stopped being seen. Lying in that ward, I found myself remembering things I hadn't thought of in years. Like the time I stayed up all night stitching Rachel's prom dress because the zipper had broken, or how Darren once broke his arm and I carried him 4 blocks to the urgent care because the car wouldn't start. They used to look at me like I was safe, like I was gravity. Now, they looked through me like I was a guest in my own life. I don't know when exactly the shift happened, when love turned into assumption, when care turned into expectation. Maybe it happened in pieces. One missed thank you, one birthday text instead of a call, one more visit that turned into, we'll try next month. Maybe that's how we lose each other, not with cruelty, but with convenience. But I feel it now, all of it, like weight that had never left, only pressed deeper into my bones. I once gave them everything I had, not out of duty, but out of devotion. And now, as I began to imagine a life beyond that hospital bed, I realized I would have to give myself something. Not forgiveness yet, but maybe the space to remember that I once mattered, and that I still do. There wasn't one moment when it all fell apart. No thunderclap, no slammed door. Just a long, slow drifting like fog rolling in over a familiar path, until one day, you can't see where it ends anymore. That's how it was with Rachel and Darren. Not a betrayal loud enough to name. Just small disappearances. One after another. Quiet. Constant. I started noticing it after my 68th birthday. That year, Rachel sent a bouquet of tulips, the wrong color, with a note that said "Love you, Mom" in handwriting that didn't feel like hers. The delivery address had a typo, the vase cracked on arrival. It wasn't the flowers that hurt. It was the way they felt like a task someone had checked off a list. Darren called the next day, cheerful but distracted. I could hear the clicking of his mouse, the hollow echo of a speakerphone in the background. He asked how I was but didn't wait for the answer. I remember staring at the phone after we hung up, wondering when my children had learned how to speak to me without really hearing me. There were so many small things, forgettable to them, unforgettable to me. A holiday not mentioned, a photo I wasn't tagged in, a missed doctor's appointment, one they said they'd drive me to, but never followed up about. I walked there that morning, past the broken sidewalk, on Marlowe Street, with an ache in my hip and my pride folded neatly in my coat pocket. I stopped offering reminders after that. When Ben, Rachel's son, turned 10, they had a party at the lake. I wasn't invited. Rachel later told me it had been last minute, just a few families, and she didn't want me to feel obligated to travel, but I had seen the photos online. It had been planned. There was a custom cake, decorations, and matching shirts. I counted 17 people. They had remembered to invite their dentist, but not me. Still, I smiled when Rachel told me about it, said I was glad Ben had fun. I hung up the phone and cried into a dish towel. I used to think these were misunderstandings. Maybe I hadn't communicated well. Maybe I expected too much. I'd apologize in my head for things I hadn't done, convince myself they were just busy, just overwhelmed, that I should be more understanding, more flexible, more quiet. But understanding becomes erasure when it's always one-sided. Darren started calling me Ma again, instead of Mom, a small thing, but it sounded foreign, like something borrowed from someone else's family. He'd never called me that growing up. It felt performative, like he was imitating a version of me he no longer knew. When I got sick last spring with a stomach flu that turned into pneumonia, I left messages for both of them, told them I was all right, just tired, just wanted to hear their voices. Rachel texted back 3 days later, "Feel better soon." Darren never replied. I spent that weekend wrapped in blankets, sipping soup I made myself, listening to the wind tap against the windows like a visitor who never came inside. I had become a background character in their lives, the person you mention in passing, the name on the emergency contact form you never expect to use. They called when they needed information about what year Grandma was born. What was the name of that family in Michigan we used to visit, but never just to talk? I was a living archive, nothing more, and yet, I kept trying. I crocheted a scarf for Rachel one winter, the kind she used to love, deep burgundy with soft gray trim. I wrapped it in tissue and mailed it with a handwritten note. Weeks passed, word. I saw it once in a photo, slung over the back of her couch, untouched. She hadn't even removed the tag. Darren forgot my birthday the next year. No card, no call. When I finally brought it up, gently, in conversation, he said, "Oh yeah, sorry, work's been insane." That was all. No embarrassment. Just the hollow apology of someone who'd stopped thinking of you as real. Even the neighbors started noticing. Mrs. Lafferty across the street asked one morning, "Aren't your kids visiting for Easter?" I lied. Told her they had other plans, that we'd talked the night before. She smiled with the kind of pity that stings. I sat alone that Easter. Made a roast chicken, anyway. Set the table for one. Played old jazz on the radio. I pretended I liked the quiet, but it wasn't the quiet that hurt. It was the absence of being remembered. The worst part wasn't what they didn't do. It was the way they didn't see what they were undoing. The way their distance wore down the edges of who I used to be in their eyes. They weren't cruel. They were careless, and carelessness, over time, becomes a kind of cruelty. There was a Christmas when I mailed out cards with handwritten notes to both of them. Inside each card, I tucked a small gift, a pressed flower for Rachel, from the garden we planted when she was 8 and 4. Darren, a scanned photo of him at age 5 with a chocolate mustache, laughing like the world hadn't yet told him how to be guarded. Neither one mentioned receiving them. No calls, no texts. I waited a week, then another. I told myself maybe the mail had been slow, maybe they'd say something on New Year's. They didn't, and that was when I started to keep count. Not of the slights, but of the spaces, the silences, the small moments I once would have filled with warmth but now left untouched. I stopped calling first, stopped sending reminders, stopped offering up my time like it had no weight. I began noticing the world again, the shape of clouds, the way the sun slanted across the porch in late afternoon. I started taking walks without my phone, not as a statement, just as a reclaiming. I needed to remember who I was when no one was asking me for anything. There were still kind moments. Ben would sometimes wave on a video call when Rachel remembered to include me. Darren sent a photo of a barbecue once, with a half-hearted "wish you were here." I smiled, responded with a thumbs up. No more than that, because by then, I understood it wasn't one big betrayal. It was 100 quiet hurts, layered like sediment, packed into the corners of my days, not loud enough to scream, but heavy enough to reshape the foundation. I used to think family was something unbreakable, that love, once given, couldn't be lost. But I've learned that even the deepest roots can rot if no one tends the soil. And, though I was still standing, something inside me had begun to lean not from weakness, but from the weight of being the only one still reaching. It was a Thursday afternoon in late August when the nurse wheeled in my discharge papers. I'd been in the hospital for almost 12 days. Pneumonia had weakened me, the infection nearly slipped into sepsis, and somewhere in between being poked and scanned and monitored, I had quietly decided that if I ever made it back to my house, I would rearrange the living room. I would move the old armchair by the window, where the light fell softly in the late mornings. I imagined sitting there, wrapped in a blanket with a cup of tea and a book, watching the birds pick at the feeder I'd meant to refill, but I never got the chance. When my friend Helen picked me up from the hospital, I noticed she hesitated before turning into my street. Her hands fidgeted at the wheel. She asked if I was sure I wanted to go straight home, or if maybe I wanted to stay at her place for a few days. I didn't understand her tone at first, not until we pulled into my driveway, or rather, into what used to be my driveway. There was a red sedan parked in my spot, one I didn't recognize. The blinds in the front room had been changed to floral curtains instead of my soft oatmeal shears. My porch plant, the one I had nursed through for winters, was gone. The welcome mat was new, and worst of all, the mailbox no longer had my name on it. There was a lockbox on the front door. It looked like a stranger lived there. I didn't say anything at first. My mind refused to catch up with what my eyes were seeing. I told Helen to wait in the car, walked slowly to the porch, legs still aching from the hospital stay. I punched in the old code, the one Darren had known, but the keypad was dead. I knocked. No answer. Then I noticed a piece of tape, folded and tucked in the corner of the window, a name written in marker dot. It wasn't mine. I turned back to the car, sat down beside Helen, and asked her quietly to tell me everything she knew. The house had been sold 3 days ago. I don't know how she found out. Maybe a neighbor had mentioned it. Maybe someone had seen the moving truck and asked questions. But I sat there, staring at the steering wheel, listening to Helen's gentle voice explain that the furniture was gone. The bookshelves, the kitchen table, even the rocking chair, all of it, gone. She didn't have the heart to tell me while I was still in the hospital. The sale had gone through while I was still recovering, still attached to an IV. No warning, no call, no message, not even a question. The house I had paid off by cleaning bathrooms and clipping coupons, the house where I raised 2 children, buried a husband, baked pies and folded Christmas wrapping paper to reuse the next year had been emptied and sold behind my back. Rachel's name was on the paperwork. I found that out later. Through the notary who had witnessed the documents. Darren had co-signed. They had transferred the deed through a loophole one I hadn't even known existed. Something about a power of attorney from years ago. One I had signed when I had surgery on my hip and trusted Rachel to pay the bills during my recovery. A temporary thing. I thought it had expired. Apparently, they had never let it lapse. The betrayal wasn't loud. There was no confrontation, no screaming, just silence and action. They had quietly decided I no longer needed my home, that they would handle it, that their version of convenience mattered more than my life's work. That night, I stayed in Helen's guest room, surrounded by lavender sheets and a small lamp that hummed when you turned it on. I didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the occasional car pass on the street, and felt something in me begin to collapse. Not all at once, just the slow folding in of something sacred, like a tent being taken down. After a long journey, the next morning, I asked Helen to drive me to the bank. I needed to see it for myself. The bank manager remembered me, a kind older man named George, who'd helped Frank and me open our first joint account after we bought the house. He walked me through the records, his face tightening with each screen he pulled up. The savings account had been nearly drained 2 weeks ago. A transfer to Rachel's account, authorized by a signature that, though it bore my name, did not look like my hand. It felt surreal, like watching someone else's tragedy unfold. There was a copy of the notarized document on file. My name, Rachel's, a series of dates and signatures. I stared at it for a long time. The lines were neat, practiced. It might have been me once, a hurried version of my signature, when I was tired or distracted. But not this time. Not this way. I asked George if anything could be done. He looked at me with the kind of pity you only give someone who has come too late to save the thing they loved, the kind of pity that doesn't try to disguise the truth. I walked out of that bank with a plastic folder and a weight in my chest that felt like grief, not just for the money or the house, but for the final loss of illusion. Up until that moment, some part of me, some aching, stubborn part still believed that maybe this was all a misunderstanding. Maybe they were planning to surprise me with something better, a new condo, an easier life. That they had my best interests at heart, just didn't know how to express it. But this wasn't confusing. This was a choice. They had chosen to cut me out, to move on, to clean the slate while I was too sick to speak. And that was the moment something inside me broke clean. Not a shatter, but a split. A separation between the mother I had been and the woman I now needed to become. There was no going back after that. No call that could undo it. No apology that could make it whole. They had taken the last piece of me that still believed, so I did what they never expected. I went silent. I didn't tell anyone right away. Not Helen, not the nurse who called to follow up on my medication, not the kind woman at the church who asked if I was feeling strong enough to return to Sunday service. I nodded, smiled, and said I was taking it one day at a time. What I didn't say was that I had no home to return to, that my family had sold it from under me, that the people who once came to me for warmth, comfort, and steady hands had turned their backs with such quiet coordination that even cruelty seemed too generous a word. I said nothing because I didn't trust my voice to carry the weight. Silence, I've learned, is not the absence of words. It's the refusal to explain yourself to people who have already decided not to listen. It's a deliberate and sharp choice. And once I made it, the world around me rearranged. I stayed with Helen for a week. She didn't ask questions, bless her, just gave me space. Her house smelled like rosemary and lemon, and each morning, she'd leave a fresh towel by the bathroom sink and a mug of tea on the kitchen table. There was a quiet rhythm to her care that reminded me of who I used to be before I became background noise in someone else's life. While she was at work, I took long walks, slow ones, my legs still weak, my body still readjusting after the hospital. I wandered down streets I didn't know, past houses with swings in the yard and wind chimes that caught the breeze. I sat on benches and watched people walk their dogs, laughing into phones, living lives I no longer felt tethered to. It was during those walks that I started to imagine a different kind of life, not a grand reinvention. I didn't dream of escape or revenge, just distance, clarity, a place where my name still meant something to someone, even if that someone was only me. I bought a notebook from the corner pharmacy, plain cover, no lines. I started jotting things down, fragments, memories, numbers, to call ideas that flickered. One page I titled, What I Still Have. Another I called, What I Will Never Let Happen Again. Most of it was blank at first, but just writing the headers gave me something solid to touch. I went to the library, used their computer. I didn't have my own anymore. I looked up tenants' rights, elder abuse laws, property transfer regulations. I didn't even know what I was looking for at first, just that I needed to understand what had been taken from me and whether there was a path to reclaim it. The silence gave me room to learn. I found a legal clinic that offered free consultations. For seniors, I made an appointment. The woman who spoke with me was younger than Rachel, but her eyes didn't dart past me like my daughter's did. She listened, took notes, asked questions. By the end of the meeting, she gently told me that while what had been done might not have been strictly illegal, it was deeply unethical, and it wasn't irreversible. That gave me something I hadn't held in months. But I didn't rush. I didn't call Rachel. I didn't send Darren an email demanding answers. I didn't ask for explanations that would be dressed in excuses. No, I let the silence stretch between us like a rope I had finally stopped tugging on. Instead, I began collecting myself in quiet ways. I reached out to an old friend I hadn't spoken to in years, Marlene, from my days at the clinic where I worked. Part-time, we'd lost touch after her move upstate, but I found her number in the back of an address book I hadn't packed before the hospital, a small mercy left behind. She answered on the second ring, and I don't know what gave me away, my voice, maybe, or the pause too long between pleasantries, but she asked if I was okay. I told her the truth, piece by piece, not all at once, and she listened. That night, she texted me a photo of a little guest cottage behind her house, said it wasn't much, but it had a working heater and a window that looked out over a hill of wildflowers. Stay here, she wrote, for as long as you need. I didn't respond right away. I stared at that photo, at the slanted roof and the crooked chimney. And for the first time since the ICU, I felt something close to safety. The next morning, I packed what I had, which wasn't much: a canvas bag of toiletries, the slippers Helen bought for me, the notebook, a small pouch with the little money I'd moved to a new bank account after the betrayal, and the folder from the bank, with copies of the transfer documents, the forged signature, and the notarization that still made my stomach twist. I wrote Helen a letter, left it on the kitchen table with a jar of her favorite marmalade, told her thank you, and meant it with every fiber of my being. Told her I needed to go find something for myself that I hadn't known I was missing. Then I boarded the early bus, north. No one knew where I was going. No one asked, and that was telling. Marlene met me at the station with 2 cups of coffee and a wool blanket folded in the back seat. She didn't press for details, just handed me the keys to the cottage and pointed out the light switch by the door. It smelled of cedar and old books. There was a small desk beneath the window, a chair with a worn cushion, and a quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed. I unpacked what little I had. I placed my notebook on the desk, sat down and opened to a blank page, and I began to write, again, not letters. Please do not modify it. Just truths. For myself, in my voice. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of me. Each morning, I brewed coffee in the little kettle Marlene kept stocked. I sat on the step outside the cottage and watched the fog lift over the wildflowers. I didn't speak to my children. I didn't read their updates. I didn't wonder what they were thinking. I let go of being the mother who waited. Bafta became the woman who watched the light change and didn't need to explain why she had stayed quiet for so long, because I was no longer silent out of sadness. Was silent because I had started listening to myself. The first time I felt the weight of silence shift into strength was a Thursday. The sun had just begun to peek over the ridge behind Marlene's cottage, casting long shadows across the hill. I had just finished my coffee and was watching a pair of deer move quietly through the brush when I realized something strange. I hadn't thought about Rachel or Darren in 2 full hours. That might not sound like much, but for someone who spent the better part of 70 years making space in her mind and heart for other people's needs, it was monumental. The quiet was no longer something that happened to me. It had become something I cultivated. In the weeks that followed, I moved differently. Not just physically, though there was that too. My body regained its rhythm, not the pace it once knew, but something more forgiving. Slower walks, steadier breathing. I began to trust my own presence again, like a house you re-enter after years away and realize still holds your scent, your creaks, your stories. I found ways to stitch my life back together, not the old life, but something stitched from the scraps I still had and the pieces I never thought to keep. I spent time at the library in town. The woman who ran the front desk, Nadine, reminded me of my younger self. Observant, unhurried, kind in that way that doesn't need to announce itself. She asked one day if I'd ever considered leading the weekly memoir circle for older women, said their last facilitator had moved away and they'd been trying to find someone who understood how to hold space for memory. I hesitated at first. Who was I to lead anything? But then I remembered the notebook back at the cottage, already full of passages, half-formed thoughts, things I hadn't said out loud in years. I told her I'd try it once. That Friday, I sat in a circle of folding chairs in the basement of the library, the scent of old paper and spearmint tea hanging in the air. And I told the story of the Christmas Rachel sang in her first school play, how I'd sat in the second row with a camcorder so bulky it left a red dent on my shoulder, just to make sure I captured every note. By the time I finished, two of the women had tears in their eyes. Something opened up in me that day. Not a flood, more like a slow, steady spring. I went back the next week, and the week after that, I began to see my own past not as something lost, but something preserved. The legal clinic had connected me with a volunteer lawyer who helped me file a formal complaint. Nothing flashy, just the beginning of a record, one that might matter later. We couldn't undo what had been signed, not without a court's decision, but we could place a marker. A line in the sand said, "This happened, and it wasn't right." I moved my bank account. I got a P.O. box. One requested new copies of my documents, everything done with calm precision. No dramatic gestures, no letters to my children, no announcements, just action. I even began volunteering at the food pantry with Marlene on Wednesdays. We organized shelves, handed out bags, asked questions no deeper than necessary. How are you? Need help carrying that? And let the dignity of ordinary kindness do its work. One morning, I received a text from Darren, "Hey, just checking in, haven't heard from you." I stared at it for a long time, typed out a dozen replies, and erased each one. What was there to say? That I had heard him loud and clear when he said nothing. That absence had taught me more than his words ever could. I didn't respond. Rachel sent a birthday card that year. No note. Just her signature, and Ben's in a scribble. I placed it in a drawer. Not from anger, but because I no longer felt the need to display what no longer held meaning. It's a strange thing to witness your own shift. I used to think strength looked like confrontation, like standing up, declaring you're hurt, demanding to be seen. But I've learned that sometimes the truest strength is not in how loudly you can speak, but in how quietly you can reclaim yourself without asking permission. I started tending to the garden behind the cottage. Wild at first, overgrown with things I didn't recognize, but I trimmed back what I could, planted bulbs where the soil felt warm, watched the bees return one by one. I even painted the old bench Marlene kept out there a soft green, like the quilt I made for Rachel before she was born. That was mine now, not the bench. The restoration. One afternoon, I found myself walking into a small consignment shop downtown. It smelled of sandalwood and old linen. I wandered the aisles, touching fabrics, old books, ceramic mugs that reminded me of my mother's kitchen. At the back was a display of second-hand furniture. Nothing fancy, but there was a wooden stool, scratched along the edge, paint chipping just so. It reminded me of the one I used to keep by the kitchen window, the one I stood on to change the curtains, the one Ben would sit on to stir cookie dough with me. I bought it for $12 and carried it home myself. Back at the cottage, I placed it under the window and sat. The breeze came in soft, and for a moment, I closed my eyes and felt the years fold into one another, not with sorrow, but with recognition. This, I realized, was what it meant to move differently. To stop asking the world to give back what it had already decided it wouldn't, and instead, to make something of what remained, not because it was easy, but because it was mine. and for the first time in a very long time, that was enough. They say grief has stages. I think absence does, too. At first, it's like background noise suddenly gone and you feel unsettled, like something familiar has been switched off. Then, as the silence lingers, you start noticing its shape, its consequences. You realize that things that ran smoothly weren't automatic, they were carried by someone, usually quietly, usually me. It didn't happen overnight, but I began to hear little echoes from the outside, from the life I'd once orbited so closely. A voicemail from Rachel's neighbor, a letter from the dentist's office, forwarded to my new address, because I had still been listed as Ben's emergency contact. These weren't olive branches. They were administrative remnants of a life I had once been essential to. Then came the silence from them. And I knew finally it was not indifference, it was uncomfortable. Because eventually, when you remove the person who held the thread, the fabric begins to fray. I don't mean to sound cruel. This is not about revenge. I didn't wish them pain. I only stepped away and watched what happens when care is removed from a space that once depended on it. Rachel had never managed the emotional weight of her own life easily. I saw it when she was young, how she internalized everything, folded hurt into politeness. I had always been her translation, her regulator, the person who could hear her sharp tone and understand it was sadness beneath. Without me, the calls with her son became strained. Ben, sweet boy that he was, had grown quieter. Marlene, whose sister lived in the same school district, mentioned once casually that she'd seen Ben waiting alone after rehearsal, Rachel arriving late and flustered. Not once, but often. There had always been a softness I lent her. Without it, I think she felt exposed. Darren had leaned on me financially in ways even he didn't realize. Little things, reminders to pay his insurance premium, coverage of surprise, dental bills when he said I'll pay you back, and we both knew he never would. I began to see, or rather, hear about, certain things unraveling. A late car payment, an issue with his taxes, even a missed registration for the community softball league he loved so much. I had been a silent net, and now they were realizing what it felt like to fall without one. Helen told me, gently, that Rachel had come by the old neighborhood one weekend in early spring. She'd asked around and said she was looking for me, just wanted to talk, but she didn't leave a note, didn't try the library, didn't ask the church. She wanted to be seen trying, not to actually find me. That's the difference between guilt and grief. Guilt wants witnesses. Meanwhile, I stayed where I was, in the cottage behind Marlon's house, living a life not filled with noise, but with meaning. Every so often, I'd receive a text from an unknown number, always brief. Are you okay? Ben, misses you. Can we talk? I never responded, not out of punishment, but because the time for words had passed. What they missed was not me, exactly. It was the function I performed in their lives. The way I made their burdens lighter. Their responsibilities are softer around the edges. And now, those edges had begun to cut. I heard from the church secretary back home that Darren had tried to make arrangements for our family's burial plot to be transferred into his name. Said he was the one managing things now. But there was a hitch. My name still held authority. A fact they'd overlooked when moving so quickly to erase me. It wasn't about the land. It was about history. About what gets carried forward. About what cannot be rewritten no matter how thoroughly you clean a house. There are always things you forget to sweep. Sometimes, I'd sit at the desk in the cottage and open my notebook to a page I had titled, What They'll Remember. It wasn't bitter, just honest. They'll remember the phone calls I answered at midnight, the care packages I sent unprompted, the way their childhood birthdays always had a theme, a cake from scratch, and a homemade banner even when money was tight. They'll remember how their clothes always smelled like lavender, how their bed sheets were warm from the dryer, how dinner showed up even when I was exhausted, and maybe, eventually, they'll remember that these things weren't automatic, that they came from someone who saw them not as burdens, but as beloved. Someone who gave out of joy, not obligation, but also someone who had limits, someone who, when pushed past the final line, did not scream. She simply stopped showing up. One day, I opened my email to find a message from Ben. Subject line, Hi Grandma. It was short, sweet, rambling in the way children still speak freely. He said he missed baking cookies with me, that school was hard, that his mom seemed tired a lot, that he was reading a book we used to read together and thought of me. I didn't reply right away. I let it sit. A week later, I wrote him back. Not about the past. Not about Rachel. Just a note, gentle, brief. I'm glad you remember the cookies. You always stirred the dough too fast, but you made the best shapes. Maybe someday we'll do that again. And I left it at that. Because even absence, when laced with kindness, can teach something. It was never about cutting them off. It was about stepping out of a role that had become invisible, and letting the echo of that absence do what words never could. They lost something when I left, and for the first time, I did not rush in to fill the hole. It had been nearly a year since I left without ceremony, since I stopped asking to be remembered, and simply let the forgetting happen. And in that time, I had grown into a version of myself I never thought I'd meet. Quieter, yes, but steadier, rooted not in what others saw in me, but in what I'd finally started to see in myself. I kept my routines simple. The garden behind the cottage had begun to bloom in full. Daisies, lavender, even a stubborn little patch of wild thyme I hadn't planted but welcomed anyway. I spent hours out there, brushing dirt from my palms, listening to the birds, watching the sun carve new shapes into the hills each evening. It was on one such evening, with a breeze carrying the smell of pine and something sweet I couldn't quite name, that I felt the need to write a letter, not to anyone. Not at first. Just something from me somewhere. A release, maybe, a reckoning. I cleared off the old desk in the corner of the cottage and laid out a fresh sheet of paper. My hands trembled more than they used to, so I took it slow. No typing, no screens, just ink, just the sound of the pen scratching across the page. And I began. Dear Lorraine, that's how I started it. Not Dear Rachel or Dear Darren, not even Dear Ben, though his letter still sat folded neatly inside my drawer. No, I wrote to the woman I had been, the one who had given and waited, and bent until she no longer recognized her own outline in the mirror, the one who had stood in her kitchen for years, stirring soups and secrets, trusting that love, quiet, consistent love, would always come back. You have been so patient, I wrote, so impossibly gentle with the world. I told her I was sorry, not for the way others had treated her, but for the way I had sometimes joined them, the way I had told her to lower her voice, soften her edges, hold her tongue. I apologized for every time I had said it's okay when it wasn't, for every time I had answered the phone when she needed to rest, for every holiday I had filled with joy for others while sitting quietly with my own emptiness. You deserved to be asked how you were, I wrote, not after the tasks were done, not after the bills were paid or the gifts wrapped or the calls returned, but first, you should have been asked first. There was no bitterness in the writing, no tally of what had been lost. Just truth, spoken plainly. Finally, to someone who would not interrupt, I wrote until my hand cramped, until the cottage grew dark around me and the only light left came from the little lamp on the windowsill. Then I folded the letter, not to mail, not to file away, but to burn. Marlene had an old fire pit behind her house, ringed in stones and charred wood from long-forgotten evenings. I went there with the letter clutched in my hand and knelt beside the ash. My knees protested, but I stayed. I struck a match, let the flame catch, and held the letter over the fire. It burned fast. Words curl quickly when they're finally ready to be released. As the last ember crumbled into smoke, I whispered something I didn't even plan. I forgive you. And I did, truly, not because everything was mended, not because the wounds had vanished, but because holding on to the ache had begun to weigh more than the memory itself, and I didn't want to carry it anymore. Forgiveness, I've learned, doesn't mean reopening the door. It just means you stop standing at it, waiting. I returned to the cottage that night, lighter than I'd felt in years. Not young, no, that ship had sailed, but unburdened. Like someone who had finally put down the basket she didn't realize she was still carrying. Days passed, then weeks. One morning, I found another letter in the mail, from Rachel. No return address. Just her handwriting, on the envelope, unmistakable in its careful curves. Inside was a card, plain, blank, no picture, just a few sentences written with more hesitation than I'd ever seen from her. I've been thinking about you, about everything. I don't expect a response. I just needed to say I'm sorry, for the house, for not checking on you, for acting like you didn't matter when you mattered more than I ever knew how to say. I don't know what to do with the guilt, but I'm learning. I hope you're safe. I read it once, then again. And then I placed it beside the letter Ben had sent. I didn't write back. not because I was angry, but because the part of me that used to rush to fix things had finally gone quiet. Their apologies were not owed to me, they were owed to themselves, and I hoped, truly, that someday they would give themselves the grace to grow from them. But I didn't need to hold their healing in my hands anymore. That was the letter that changed me, not because it came from someone else, but because it followed. The one I wrote to myself because, when I let go of the hope that they'd come back as the people I remembered, I made space to welcome who I had become. A woman who did not explain her silence. A woman who no longer sat in the shadows waiting to be chosen. A woman who, finally, understood that her worth was never something to be proven, it was something to be lived. I never expected this life. Not the cottage, not the garden, not the long walks with no destination and no one waiting at the end. I had spent decades tethered to other people's calendars, other people's emergencies, birthdays, lists, and needs. The sudden quiet was disorienting at first, but slowly, it became something else entirely. It became sacred. There's a stillness to my days now. Not empty, just unhurried. I wake when the light comes in through the curtains, soft and angled, like it's asking permission to be there. I make my coffee the same way each morning. 1 spoon of sugar, 1 splash of milk, and I carry it outside to the bench I painted. The green is chipped in places now, worn by weather and time, but it suits me. I've grown fond of things that don't pretend to be perfect. Sometimes I sit there for an hour before saying a single word, just breathing, just watching the leaves move. I've come to understand how full a moment can be when no one is asking you to be anything else. I tend to my garden most mornings. The soil here is stubbornly rocky in some places, too dry in others, but I've learned to work with it, not against it. I water early, before the sun gets too high, and I talk to the plants like they're old friends. I've even named a few of them, though I wouldn't admit it to anyone but Marlene. She comes by often, usually with a basket of muffins or a new book she's picked up at the library sale. We sit at the table by the window, sometimes talking, sometimes not. With her, silence never feels like something that needs to be filled. It's just a place we both know how to rest inside. I write, too, not every day, and not for anyone else. Just little pieces of memory, fragments of thought, things I want to leave behind in case someone ever wonders who I really was beneath the mother, the wife, the woman in the hospital bed they once almost forgot. Sometimes I write about the house, not the betrayal, but the beauty, the way the kitchen smelled like cinnamon in the winter, how the light would catch the dust in the hallway around 4 p.m., and for a moment it looked like everything was made of gold. I don't miss the things they took. I missed the pieces of me I left inside them. But even that ache has softened. Time does that, not by erasing, but by dulling the sharp edges, making it possible to hold what once cut you. Rachel hasn't written again, Darren hasn't called. I think they're still finding their way, and maybe they always will be. I used to think closure required conversation, a final explanation, and reckoning. But now I know some endings come quietly. You just stop checking the mailbox, you stop looking at your phone, and one day, you realize the waiting is gone. And that's peace, too. Ben wrote a second letter. This one longer. He told me he was reading more now, that he missed our stories. He included a little drawing of a sunflower and a rocking chair. I placed it on my windowsill, not as a bridge back, but as a reminder that some roots grow again, even when the first tree is gone. I haven't told him where I am, not yet. Maybe I will someday, when it feels right. When I know he isn't just reaching out of nostalgia, but from a place of his own choosing. For now, it's enough to know that somewhere, he's thinking of me without being told to. My days are simple. I walk to the market on Tuesdays. I water the garden. I make soup in batches and freeze what I don't eat. I watch old films on a little television with rabbit ears Marlene found at a garage sale. I read, I write, I rest. Sometimes I sit by the fire pit behind the cottage, the same one where I burned my letter, and I close my eyes. The wind here smells different from the city, more pine, less smoke. I like it. I like the way the air wraps around me like a coat I didn't know I needed. The truth is, I'm not rebuilding anymore. I'm not waiting for reconciliation or apologies or some dramatic return. I'm not angry. I'm not wounded. I'm just still. I've given enough. And now, in this quiet little chapter, I finally understand that I am enough without proving, without pleading, without being needed. There's a certain dignity in choosing peace over explanation. In walking away, not with bitterness, but with breath. I don't carry the weight of what they did anymore. That belongs to them now. What I carry is gentler. A slower kind of love, one that holds only what it can, and lets the rest pass like wind through open windows. Some nights, I lie in bed with the window cracked and listen to the trees. They speak in rustles and hushes, not unlike the voices I used to fill my head with expectations, regrets, echoes of old conversations. But now, they sound different, more like lullabies than reminders. I keep a candle on my nightstand, lavender-scented. I light it some evenings just for myself, even if no one else will see the glow, and I write one sentence in my notebook before I sleep. Something true, something quiet. Sometimes it's just the words, stillness, root, enough. Other times, a full thought. Last night I wrote, I wasn't angry. I was finally empty, and that was beautiful.